Dr. Marc LiVecche is the McDonald Distinguished Scholar of Ethics, War, and Public Life at Providence magazine. He is also a non-resident research fellow at the US Naval War College in the College of Leadership and Ethics. Marc completed doctoral studies, earning distinction at the University of Chicago. His first book, The Good Kill, Just War and Moral Injury, was published in 2021 by Oxford University Press. Another project, Responsibility and Restraint, James Turner Johnson and the Just War Tradition, was co-edited with Eric Patterson and was published by Stone and Tower Press in the fall of 2020. And he is currently finalizing Moral Horror, A Just War Defense of Hiroshima. Before he got into his PhD, he was working in Central Europe, doing a number of things, including working at a Christian Studies and Research Center. And he led seminars on history and ethics outside of the former Auschwitz-Birkenau Nazi concentration camp in Poland. And I know he has a personal connection with his faith to the story of the Holocaust, which I'm sure he'll share with you today. So everyone welcome Dr. Marc LiVecche.
Thank you very much. There's no clock, all right. All right, I'm relying on you guys to talk and to ask questions, things like that. I've got like an hour and a half, 90 minutes. Nobody, and if you need proof of this, call my family, I'll give you their number. Nobody wants to hear me talk for 90 minutes. So my plan is 45 minutes to an hour to get through some stuff that I want in hand, and then conversation, all right? So I will attempt to say things that are provocative, not for the sake of provocation, but for the sake of good conversation. So that'll be my plan. I understand, I got distracted, so I don't know if you said the title, but I understand my title will be something like Just War and the Morality of the Eradication of Hamas.
Yes,
something
to destroy and delegitimize.
Right. Now there's a small part of me, the more macabre part of me, that goes like this when I hear this title. Right? That's probably a little bit inappropriate because we're going to talk about some grim stuff. But the motivation behind the maybe let's call it joy of that, is not necessarily inappropriate. And by the time we get to the end of this talk, I hope I've maybe convinced you of that. All right, I understand that this talk is also in the context of a day in which you are going to spend a chunk of time studying and encountering the Holocaust, right? Which I hope everybody knows is the Hitler regime's attempted extermination of European Jewry during the Second World War. I say that not to be condescending, but because I have discovered in recent years that not everybody knows, which is a little bit shocking to me, but I might just be dating myself. I'm comfortable with this talk coming before an encounter with the Holocaust because, as has already been said, a lot of my own personal faith journey, and certainly why it is that I am a just war ethicist or a just war scholar, has, if not everything, very nearly everything to do with my original encounter with Holocaust. And I am going to get into that a little bit. I see just war as an intersection with Holocaust. And to substantiate that, I'm going to give you a number, and the number is 13.8. Right, so this is going to become important in a moment. James probably, if he's been paying attention to anything I've said in the past, already knows what 13.8 represents. If you don't know, you will soon. My encounter with Holocaust, I'm going to start with that because that grounds, as I've said, just about everything that I do. Dying atheist, kind of knew Christianity or the tenets of Christianity, the claims of Christianity were true. Did not want them to be true. I didn't want to be interfered with. And I was cognizant enough to recognize that Christianity, among much else, was going to be a great interference to a guy who wanted to do whatever the hell he wanted to do. Right? That's just sort of how that goes. So I tried to avoid it. And one of the very foolish things I did, not necessarily to try to avoid it, but I found myself studying the Holocaust. I went to a school that had a semester, an interim, a J term, right, where you spent 1 month studying one subject. And the one subject that I decided to study that 1 month was Holocaust. Right, so 4, 5, 6 hours a day of concentrated study, lots of reading afterwards, discussion groups, reading groups, all the rest. And at the time I was a bicycle racer, and the biology professor of all sort of things at my college was also a bicycle rider. And he was an Italian. I'm a LiVecche. He was a Giannini. I went to St. Olaf College, so there were Bjornsons and Olafsons. Nothing wrong with these folks, but they don't usually talk with their hands, and they were very confusing to me. So Giannini and I would get together and we would commiserate. And he invited me to share with him everything I was learning about the Holocaust. And I think he was setting me up. He was a Christian. I was not. He knew I wasn't a Christian. That was all okay. But I would come in for lunch, and day after day I would complain about the Nazis, the evils that they were doing. And sort of the visual for this is me, as a dying atheist, shaking my fist at Auschwitz and saying, "God damn this," right? And meaning that actually unwittingly as a prayer, right? But then Giannini, the objective, the believer in objective truth that he was, confronted me with the notion that when I shook my fist at Auschwitz and condemned it, I was only saying something about myself and my opinion, not anything substantial about Auschwitz, because I had no God, and I had no standard of right and wrong, no ultimate standard. It was just my opinion versus Nazis' opinion. And this was very unsettling to me, because I wanted my fist shaking to say something about Auschwitz and not just about my mood, which I knew would change with circumstances. All right, so that began sort of a long walk toward faith. I often put it that I became a Christian because I wanted to hate well, and I wanted grounds to hate. All right? I know the rest of this talk is going to be about love, so it's going to be okay. But hate is a really good doorway toward love in certain circumstances. All right, and we're commanded to abhor certain things and to cling to other things. All right, that's hate and that's love. All right, so that's that. A couple definitions. Just war. What is it? Let's call that a model of political stewardship for managing moral conflict. Let's deal with the second part of that first, moral conflict. So everyday decisions are generally easy. What are you going to have for breakfast, right? There's usually, although increasingly the environmentalists tell us this isn't true, there's usually not a lot of moral content in deciding what you're going to have for breakfast. Cage-free eggs, I get it, versus free range or whatever it is we've got notwithstanding. Some moral decisions are reasonably easy, right? Basic moral decisions we make every day, no big deal. Should I steal or should I not steal? Generally speaking, easy to do, right? Don't steal. If you're Jean Valjean and there's a bakery store window standing between you and your starving children, right? Maybe a little bit more complicated. So moral conflict, in this latter case, when I say moral conflict today, all I'm talking about is that conflict that happens when when two or more goods, moral duties, conflict. And that it seems, on the surface at least, and maybe all the way through, that by pursuing one moral duty, you almost by definition cannot pursue that other moral duty. All right, so that's a conflict. All right, so trolley problems, right? Philosophers like to talk about these types of things. Or in war, to harm another being is to do an evil, right? I hope we understand that. But to protect another human being from harm is a moral good. It's a duty, right? There are times, because of the decisions of other people, that we cannot do this one thing without violating the duty not to harm others, right? And so in some cases, the duties shift, right? They begin to change with circumstance. I might say, depending on where my mood takes me, I might talk about how moral rules work in the world. Some people will quip that Christianity is a religion without rules. They don't mean that. Paul Ramsey's famous for teasing this. All he means is that the moral duties in Christianity are rather capacious. They're things like love. Right? Okay, great. So that's a moral duty. In fact, it's an absolute obligation. But what does love look like in certain circumstances? So for instance, when one of my neighbors is unjustifiably kicking apart the face of another one of my neighbors, and he will not stop, what does love look like in this situation? Right? Because I'm supposed to love both neighbors. And I can't say, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to love, let's call him the victim neighbor now, and then later, when the smoke clears, I'll start to love my, let's call him enemy neighbor again. Right? That's no good. I'm supposed to love both of them now, right? We agree? But it seems also clear that I cannot love both of them in exactly the same way, in exactly the same moment. But I'm called to love them. So what does that look like? And just war as a model for political stewardship helps us figure these things out. All right? The broader definition for just war, is that it is a model for political stewardship that helps the sovereign, the political authority, over whom there is no one greater charged with the care of the political community, to know when, in the last resort, love demands that in order to protect the innocent, or to take back what's been wrongly taken, or to punish evil, we have to use necessary, proportionate, and discriminate lethal force. All right, that's sort of it in a nutshell. I'm going to break down all of that now. But before I do, I owe you an explanation of 13.8. So, dying atheist, I know Christianity is true. I haven't really read my Bible, so I didn't know that you couldn't go overseas and avoid God. Right? So I go from Minnesota to Bratislava, Slovakia, because I want to go someplace, one, where I can teach English and just figure out, okay, I've got a literature degree. What am I going to do with this? Do I like to teach? Let's go somewhere where I can teach. Let's go somewhere where the Holocaust happened, because then I could continue to study it. Right? So I land on the ground in Bratislava, and I find myself at the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, so in 1995, January 95. So at the end of the formal ceremonies, they began to read the names of all the lost over loudspeaker. And they said that they would read the names of all the lost until they had read the entire list. All right? So my buddy and I toured the camp afterwards for several hours. The names are being read, name after name after name after name. Right? Constant litany, unbroken of names. We walk away, we're going down the tracks back toward town. We can hear receding in the distance, name after name after name after name after name after name. We find ourselves in a Polish pub, which is generally a happy place to find yourself. And over a couple pints, we decided we should figure out how long this reading of names will take. Right? So now it's all sort of counterfactual. We don't have the names of all the estimated 1.2 million people killed in just that one camp system. But if we had all the names of 1.2 million souls killed there, and if it took 1 second to read each name, then to read 1.2 million names at the rate of 1 a second would take 13.8 days. Okay? 13.8 days of an unbroken litany of lost, stolen souls. All right? So I'm very nearly converted at this point, and I want my new faith to have something to say about preventing a 14th day. Right? Because if it couldn't do that, then, dust off the shoes and walk away. Right? And ideally, does it have anything to say about preventing day one? Right? I become a Christian. I start taking Christian friends up through Auschwitz-Birkenau because a lot of my young Central European friends hadn't formally studied the Holocaust, which seemed like a strange move for the communists, but they didn't teach it. And they wanted to know what happened, because I had one Ukrainian friend tell me, because I had given a talk and the Holocaust featured in it. She came up afterwards and said, well, thank you for mentioning the Holocaust, because growing up I knew it was bad and had something to do with Jews, and now you've sort of explained it to me, right? So I would take people up through Auschwitz-Birkenau, but these older Christian friends would ask me, what are Christians supposed to do about something like the Holocaust? And I would say, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, after all, we're pacifists. And this was sort of a shock to me, right? I'm Irish and I'm Sicilian by extraction, right? There's no capacity for pacifism in me, not genetically. I think the only way you would find pacifism in me is if I ate one, right? Which would be kind of easy to do because, they're pacifists, right? So it would be unfair. But I was terribly distraught, right? I had two great shocks in my young Christian life. One, I was friends with some Baptists who told me, well, now you can't drink. And I was like, what? Right? Discovered, nope, I got it passed, they're wrong. I don't know. Because I knew you would feel the pain, right? So I dodged that bullet, and I was feeling good about myself, and now I'm confronted with the idea that I'm supposed to be a pacifist, right? Which would make me drink if I had to be a pacifist. All right, so that's 13.8. Okay, just war tradition. If you know anything about the just war tradition, how many people have had any sort of formal study of just war? Okay, good. All right, some of you? All right, fine. So some of this is going to be, what do you call it, when you review stuff? Repetitive? Not repetitive. There's a word for it. It doesn't matter. It's good. Some of this is going to be a review. Some of it is going to be new. Very broadly, just war is broken into two main categories. They give them fancy Latin words, right? The first is basically helps you decide when is it right to fight. All right, that's the jus ad bellum, right? And I would write these down, but I forgot to bring a PowerPoint or whatever I should do. But jus ad bellum. Basically, you could call it the jab, right? When is it right to fight? And then the second major category is the jus in bello, or the jib. You got the jab and you got the jib. The jab, when is it right to fight? The jib, how do you rightly fight the fight that's right to fight? Okay? Those are the two main things. If my name was Eric Patterson, then I would tell you there's a third category, and the third category is the jus post bellum, justice after war. But as we go through the two categories, I'm going to explain why I don't expand it to three categories. Classically, historically, it's two categories. I stick with those. All right, the jab, when is it right to fight? This is broken into two main parts itself. The first chunk is sometimes called the deontological categories. That's a big fancy word. It should conjure Kant in your minds, which should to some degree make you run screaming from the room. But if you're still here, then all deontological means in this sense is the duties. Right? The first category of things have to be in place for a war to be justified. And then there's a second category of things that are more prudential, wisdom-based categories that help you evaluate the duties. And we'll get into how it does this in just a moment. So the duty part is itself broken into three main bits. Right? The first thing, before you know it's right to fight, you need a proper authority with the political responsibility for deciding these things. All right, so you need a proper authority or a sovereign. All right, and as I said earlier, a sovereign is he or she or it or they. This isn't a pronoun thing. This is just there are different types of government. This is the body of people over whom there is no one greater charged with the care of the political community. All right. This should start to conjure up the definition that I gave you that just war is a model of political stewardship. Stewardship might make you think of things like dominion, which ought to take us back to the cradle garden, which ought to remind us that we were made in the image of God. And then you ask yourself, well, what's that mean? And one of the things it means at least comes immediately following, let us make man in our image, and let him have dominion over all the earth. All right, dominion sounds maybe to modern ears like domination. It's not domination, it's stewardship. It's providential care, which is why the journal Luke and I started, it's called Providence, right? It's stewardship over creation. Human beings are supposed to exercise responsibility for the conditions of history and in history. It's not ultimate responsibility, but it's delegated, at least penultimate responsibility. Right? Of course, as Luke said last night, like a couple chapters later, there's the fall. Right? Human beings were made with freedom. Why? I think, and we could probably argue about this, but I think we were made to be free because God wants us to love him. And love has to be free or it's not love. Right? And love carries certain risks. One of the risks is we won't do the thing for which love was designed because we're free. Right? And then chapter 3 reveals the fact, I hope this isn't a spoiler, that we in fact misused our freedom. Right? We walked away from the purposes of our freedom. So now the exercise of stewardship, the exercise of dominion, moving forward, has to take into account the fact of the fall. Right? And that's a problem. And that creates these moral conflicts that we've talked about. It's true for individuals. Romans 13 tells us that this is true for governments as well. Governments have the same kind of responsibility to exercise dominion, to exercise stewardship, and they're going to have to do so under conditions of the fall. They're always going to have to contend with these facts. Right? All right, so political sovereignty. When it comes to intersecting this with the question of the eradication of Hamas, it should be fairly obvious that the Israeli government has a responsibility to care for the welfare of its people. Right? So there's different ways of talking about moral obligations. All of us have obligations to perform certain moral duties. This is just fact. So one of those duties being to love. Right? There's another dimension to moral duties that are more case dependent. So this idea of following duty is universal. Everybody has to do this, right? There's another kind of moral duty that are more contextual, right? I have certain moral duties as a dad, right, that maybe you don't have, at least toward my kids, right? So I'm sorry, I don't know you all well enough, so I don't dislike any of you. But if you were hiking with my children, and you and my child fell into a nest of vipers, guess who I pull out first, right? I'm going to pull my kids out first. Partly, that's not just nepotism. Part of that is a moral duty. I have a special obligation of care to my kids, right, over the responsibility that I have for you. Now, of course, if my child doesn't fall into the nest of vipers, but you do, I pull you out. So it's not as if the special obligation I have to my kids cancels or dismisses any responsibility that I have to you, right? It's just context dependent. Of course, if you and I are walking and my child, who's 17 and fast, runs ahead of us and falls into a nest of vipers, and then at some point you get ahead of me and you see my son in the nest of vipers and you jump in just as I get there, and I look down and you've just been bitten, my son is already like blue and bloated and not looking well, who do I pull out first? Maybe I pull you out because the circumstances have shifted, right? But the bottom line, we have special obligations. The Israeli government, should be clear, has a special obligation to its own people to care for their welfare, to provide certain political goods, order and justice, and therefore the conditions necessary for something that approximates peace. All right, that's an obligation. From time immemorial in the Middle East, but at least from October 7th onward, it should be clear that order, justice, and the peace of Israeli citizens has been willfully violated by this group called Hamas. All right, and the Israeli government has a responsibility to push back against that. It's worth pointing out that Hamas, however illegitimate an authority it has become, is the duly elected at one point authority in Gaza, and they too have sovereign responsibilities to the people over whom they are supposed to be appropriately ruling. All right, they have botched that responsibility. That should be clear. They've had, 14, 15 years to build a state. Instead, they built 400 miles of tunnels, multi-layers, right? They built an arsenal of weapons that they cache in hospitals and mosques and other places of worship and private homes and schools and these sorts of things. So they had every opportunity to build a state, and instead they built a military, right? With one sort of pledge to eradicate Jews from the land. Right, so political responsibility has, and the exercise of it, or the failure to exercise it, has consequences. And this is grotesquely unfair to the people that are wrongly suffering the consequences of that, but that's just one of those things that is almost like a law, right? The responsibilities that I have to my kids can be botched. I can misuse my authority as a father, and my kids will suffer for that. Is that fair? Of course it's not. But it's probably more fair that my children suffer the evil decisions that I make than your children suffer the consequences of the evil decisions that I make. That's grotesque, right? That should sit painfully, but that doesn't make it less true, right? So political responsibility is the first thing. The second thing is a just cause. Obviously, you need a reason to fight a right fight. It's not enough just to say more goods will come from this. So it may be true that by invading, whatever primitive country A over there, and by bringing them Netflix and Tupperware and other good things, we will drastically improve their life. But that is not an acceptable reason to go to war, right? So you don't do it just to achieve some good. There are three reasons that Thomas Aquinas lists for having a justified cause. And Thomas Aquinas, if you want to know more about the just war tradition, is probably in many ways the pivotal figure, in part because he looks back at Augustine, who in turn looks back to the Greco-Roman or classical inheritance that has given us some of the more latent or tacit elements of just war thinking. Augustine began to percolate some of this into his theology and especially into his pastoral letters to military commanders who were Christians wrestling with their responsibility as commanders, and he helped them think this through. But Augustine, who's often called the father of just war tradition, didn't have anything really organized. You have to look for it across his corpus, and it's a big corpus. Well, Thomas Aquinas does a lot of that work for us and begins the process of sort of ordering it into a structure. So he looks back, and then almost everybody forward of Thomas Aquinas look back at Thomas Aquinas. So he's kind of a key pivotal figure. He lists 3 appropriate reasons to go to war. The first is to protect the innocent. Now, I want you to listen to what he doesn't say, which might be surprising, okay? He lists protection of the innocent, taking back things wrongly taken, and the punishment of evil. Those are the 3 reasons why it would be appropriate to go to war. All right, what didn't you hear directly that might surprise you, being good international law-abiding Americans?
Stopping something from happening.
Okay, that's fair. That's baked in. Let's just presume that's there.
Revenge?
Revenge, sure. The positive motivation for revenge is the punishment of evil, right? Punishment shouldn't be revenge, but that's different. But yeah, last guess. It's all on you.
I mean, genocide.
Okay, but that's protection of the innocent, or that's punishing evil, right? So that's baked in. Self-defense. I didn't say self-defense, right? International law, there's basically one reason to go to war. It's self-defense. Okay, and then we created this thing called R2P, responsibility to protect, because we realized, yeah, we probably have to protect others too, right? Because that got icky when we just said, well, it's all about protecting ourselves. So I don't say self-defense, in part because Thomas Aquinas doesn't say self-defense, but that's baked in, right? And it's baked in an important way. If I attack you unjustifiably, I have no reason to attack you, but I do, and it turns out you're like a ninja, right? And you start to beat the bejeebies out of me, right? I'm 52, I've got a bad back. This would be easy, right? Now I'm losing this fight. Can I pull out a sidearm and shoot her in the chest and then claim, well, self-defense? She was beating the tar out of me, right? Can I do that? No, right? That's not self-defense. I have no right to protect myself from the harms she is doing to me because I instigated the harms. I've left myself open to them. Right? I've waived my rights by my actions, my free actions, not to be harmed by her. I've forfeited my rights. Right? And so she has every right to do to me what she's doing to protect herself. So instead of trying to deal with this, Thomas Aquinas just qualifies everything. Protect the innocent. Right? Take back what's been wrongly taken. Punish evil. Right, the qualifications are sewn all the way through. All right, those are the 3 causes for a justified war, under which you'll find genocide and all the rest. And because protect the innocent is the term, now my special obligations that I owe exclusively to my own people become less zero-sum. Right, it doesn't have to be a matter of, whatever I do for Americans has to be at the expense of other people. Right? If I'm a big enough country, if I have great enough resources, then I can sort of spread my responsibilities wider, which I think creates interesting questions about the responsibility of certain nations to develop certain capacities. Right? So my PhD supervisor, Jean Bethke-Elstein, who was about that tall, but just a battle axe, would often talk about the Spider-Man ethic. Right? You know what the Spider-Man ethic is? With great power comes? Okay. So if that's true, and if part of that great responsibility is to expend power for the sake of others, to what degree do I have a responsibility to cultivate power, right? Both as a nation and also individually. Like there's all these great stories about Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan uses the power that he has as a resource to promote the welfare of others. Supposedly he was standing at a traffic light or sitting at a traffic light in his car, and he sees this woman walk by with a violin, and she's waiting across the street, and he's waiting to drive on, so he rolls down his window, and he says, "Hey, can you play that?" She goes, "Yeah, I can play that." And he says, "Let's hear." So they pull over, and she plays, and the next thing she knows, she's on tour with Bob Dylan. I don't know if this is apocrypha or not, but this is a simple way of illustrating that he has accumulated to himself a certain wealth of power, right? He has certain resources, and what's he do with them? He expends them for the welfare of others. So what responsibility does a nation like America that has an enormous capacity to gather to itself enormous power, what responsibility do we have to gather that power to ourselves and then to spend it for the welfare of ourselves and others? Right? I think it's a real question. I think it's a real question for individual Christians. All right. Right intent is the third requirement that you have to have in place. All right, the right intent. And I suppose we could, and maybe I'll save this for the Q&A, but we could talk about whether or not Hamas has a justified cause before we leave justified cause entirely. They will make certain claims about why it is they behave the way they do. I think we can invalidate those claims. They talk about it, being resistance to the occupation. As far as I'm aware, Israel hasn't occupied Gaza since 2005. On and on and on, right? We can talk about what that looks like. But the third requirement that you have to have in place for a war to be justified is the right intent, okay? And the right intent is very simple. We go to war, Augustine tells us, in order to achieve peace, all right? That's it. Now, peace is capacious. It's peace in the first place for those who are being oppressed by whatever it is that gives you cause for a war in the first place. So if at the end of the fight, all I've done is secured peace for the endangered innocent, that's sufficient, all right? But ideally, we go to war in order to bring about the conditions necessary for reconciliation with our adversary, all right? That's ultimately the purpose of peace, to reconcile. You could say it this way, that just war, properly understood, is the first step in the path toward forgiveness, okay? Forgiveness, Christians botch all the time. We forgive too quickly, I think, and we short-circuit an incredibly important cycle that has to happen in those who have done wrong, right? They have to recognize the error of their ways. They have to repent. They have to turn away from those ways. They have to sometimes pay penance, restitution. They have to convincingly demonstrate that they have no intention of doing the thing again. And maybe after that, it's safe to begin reconciling relationships. All right, but we short-circuit that. And if we short-circuit that, I think one of the problems is we may take away the capacity of guilt and shame to work the graces that God uses guilt and shame to work, right? Which is the recognition that what I've done is wrong and has to stop. Okay, so just war is a means, ideally, of bringing our adversary into line with what they've done and having them turn away from it. Okay. Here's a good place to stop and to acknowledge that all of this sounds terribly judgy, right? And I get that, but just war is an act of political stewardship, or is a model of political stewardship, which is full of judgment, right? And we can't be afraid of that because that's like the best we can do, right? We have to look at circumstances and we have to make judgments. We do this every single day, right? And judgments themselves are not wrong. Thinking we're necessarily a whole lot better than the guy or the regime that we're judging, that might be precarious morally for us, but we have to make the judgments, especially when we have responsibility and duties of care for people beneath us. We really have to make those judgments, and we have to act on those judgments. We can't be afraid of that. So a lot of what I'm saying is very neat because I am presupposing that we're standing on the side of in a justified war, so it's right to bring our adversary to repentance, right? That gets more complicated when the fight is less clear, or the morality of the fight is less clear. That's the right intent, right? Of course, the problem with this is the enemy always gets a vote. And the enemy gets to decide whether or not the end of the conflict is going to result in any kind of a renewed relationship. At the end of World War II, the Allies did extraordinary jobs of reconciling with the enemy. But the German people needed to decide that that's what they wanted, and the Japanese people needed to decide that, yes, that's something that we want. And I will argue that one of the, baked into this idea that the right intent is peace, baked into that idea is the fact that over all of this, the right intent in a justified war is to win. If a war is right to fight, it's right to win. Okay? We're uncomfortable with that nowadays. All right? Especially when we look at the situation in Gaza right now. Western allies of Israel seem preoccupied with telling Israel to stand down, to accept a ceasefire, to not go into Rafah. Now that they've gone into Rafah, to not go in with 2 battalions but 1. Right? All this sort of crazy short-circuiting of a process that has to run its course if something like peace is ever going to be found in the Middle East. right? So wars that are right to fight are right to win. The objective of war is victory, all right? And World War II teaches us that that victory has to be decisive. It has to be decisive enough for the enemy to know, I don't want to fight anymore. And you help an enemy know that when you've destroyed their will or their capacity, or ideally both, to continue the fight. All right? And so Israel, to my mind, has to be given the time and the space necessary to eradicate Hamas by taking away their military ability to, for defensive and offensive actions, and for taking away their political ability as an authority to exercise dominion within Gaza, because they've demonstrated an incapacity to do that. Right? And those, is that a question?
Yeah, but you're right.
Go ahead.
This may be a question for another time, but let's say Israel eradicates Hamas as Hamas currently is.
Yep.
Hamas has done, not that I am a scholar by any sorts, but Hamas has gone, okay, cool. But then a lot of the Palestinian people, I imagine, can just build another Hamas.
Yep.
And how could Israel prevent that from happening?
Right. Great question and necessary question, right? So, a lot of people will say you can't eradicate Hamas because Hamas is an idea.
Yeah.
And so to the extent that Hamas is an idea, yeah, it becomes incredibly difficult to eradicate. Right. Difficult, not impossible. Right. Nazism was an idea that it turned out we could eradicate. Now somebody could say, oh, but look at the German elections, right? So I get it, right? These things, right, they come and go. But Nazism as an idea was more or less uprooted, at least to a significant and practically helpful degree, right? Now, the underlying currents are all still there, I get it. And Japanese militarism, even better an example than Nazism. Japanese militarism, for 100 years motivated Japanese belligerence. That idea was firmly eradicated at the end of World War II. They overlearned, even Germany as a nation, I think, overlearned the lesson. They took on almost a pacifist ethic, right? Go ahead.
Well, right, but Palestine doesn't yet have like an actual political order.
Nope, none.
It functions, and Germany and
Right.
Japan kind of
Yep,
did.
yep. So there are differences,
Right.
absolutely. All I'm saying here is that ideas can be eradicated,
Right.
right? Poorly, incompletely,
Yeah.
only approximately,
Yeah.
right? So what might Israel do to help promote the possibility that after eradicating Hamas as a predominant embodiment of a particular idea,
Yeah.
what can they do to try to help and allow Palestinian society to move forward? One of the things, and this is way above my pay grade, right? But one of the reasons why I thought they really needed to go into Rafah was because one, the last military battalions capable of offensive or defensive actions that Hamas had were in Rafah. So you need to go in there and you need to kill them, right? And when you kill them, then you presumably take away the ability of Hamas to man the intersections and the conduits into which aid might come and supplies might come in from Egypt. And so once you eradicate Hamas's ability to maintain those checkpoints, and you've gotten rid of Hamas as a political body to exercise authority over what comes in and out, then you can seize that responsibility, and you can begin, if I was an Israeli, and again, all this might be wrong, this is me analyzing the bits that I know. If I was the Israeli government, I would then begin to lavish supplies, as they've done in the past, into Gaza, and try to find local leaders that are not Hamas affiliated to the best of our ability to know that, and to put them in positions of responsibility, and to begin building them up by, helping those around them to identify them as responsible leaders. That's the best you can do. I'll just leave it there. This would be a great question for somebody like Luke. But when we got rid of the Nazi capacity for defensive and offensive actions, we could have walked away, and in all likelihood, the same kind of animosities that were stewing from the very botched, very bad, very indecisive peace of World War I that led to Hitlerism, all those things were still there. right? And then instead of exacting torturous retribution, we rebuilt them, right? And that had to pay all sorts of dividends. So the Marshall Plan as a means of securing a decisive victory already won, and then turning that decisive victory into an enduring peace. I think the Marshall Plan is a model for that kind of action. And I imagine it's well within Israel's capacity to exercise something like a Marshall Plan on a destroyed Gaza in order to try to bring Palestinians of goodwill, who I have to believe exist, and I think we know some of them, to help be able to bring them forward, right? And you begin eliminating any of the excuses people have for further belligerence. Now, some people will still practice further belligerence, and so that's why, the day after Hamas is destroyed, Israel doesn't stand down as a military, right? They maintain the wall, they do all the things they have to do. All I know is that none of that will happen so long as Hamas remains in power. And so the first step, kill it. And then do what you can, right? And a lot of that is going to depend on the Palestinian people because they have the ultimate vote, right? That should be thoroughly unsatisfying, but that's the best I have. All right, so that's right intent. The right intent should be victory, achieved through decisively winning in order to bring about the conditions necessary for a durable peace. All right? Okay, those are the deontological bits that I said. If you don't have those three things, proper authority, a justified cause, and the right intent, you can't go to war. It's an unjustified war. All right, so you've got those three duties in place, those three requirements. Now there's this collection of prudential concerns, because sometimes, and this should bite, sometimes duty is insufficient, right? Sometimes in this world, because of the arrangement of this world and human freedom and all of that, we can't do our duty. All right, so Rwanda. And I'm going to give an example that's actually, it's a good example of what I'm going to say, but I think it's a bad example because I think we're wrong about it. In Rwanda, there was a genocide going on, right? It ought to have been stopped. We saw it coming. We knew it was coming. We should have done something about it. So we had a duty. All those three things should have identifiably been in place. But much of the West said, we don't have the capacity to do anything about this. Like, we're only going to make matters worse. These sorts of things. We don't have the lift capacity. We can't intervene. So they made a prudential decision that they couldn't do their duty. All right? I happen to think the analysis was wrong. We could have done all sorts of things. But this is the kind of thing. There are occasions where we can't do something, even though we have a duty to do it, okay, because of typically competing duties. All right, depending on who you ask, you're going to get a different array of prudential criteria. I think I named three. One of them is fairly obvious. It's last resort. All right, so you've identified a set of things that are in place that would allow you to pull the trigger and go to war. Of course, you should make sure that other means have been exhausted. All right, so when you confront an evil act, sometimes just a rebuke is enough to stop it. And if a rebuke is sufficient, you stop with the rebuke. All right, if something more is needed, then you escalate that up trajectory, finally toward lethal force. All right, so last resort. Is it the last resort? A lot of people get hung up on this because they think, well, we haven't tried everything, right? This doesn't literally mean that we try every single thing we can do before we go to war. It just means that you give the time to consider whether or not other options are viable, right? So you don't literally have to try anything, but you have to consider other means, right? So last resort. Another is proportionality. All right, and proportionality appears in both the jab, the use ad bellum, when is it right to fight. Proportionality will also appear in the jib, so the use in bello, how do you rightly fight the fight that's right to fight. In the use ad bellum, in when is it right to fight, proportionality is asking a big question. It's just saying, okay, we've identified a cause for war. By going in and fighting this war, are we likely to do more good than harm? All right, so it's a proportionate evaluation of the goods versus the harms that are likely to come about. But you also have to ask yourself the reverse question. We've got a cause, And there are going to be enormous costs to overturning that cause. By not going to war, are we likely to do more good than harm? Right, so the question has to be asked in both directions. That's very roughly proportionality in the jus ad bellum sense. And then the last one is probability of success. Right, so we have a cause. We don't think anything short of lethal force is going to mitigate that cause. We think more good will come than evil from pursuing this fight to a decisive victory. But here's the thing, like we have no capacity to pull this thing off. Like it's not going to happen. Right? And so then the question really becomes, do we go in and start killing people and breaking things with no real hope of overturning the causes for war in the first place? All right? And most occasions, if that's clearly the case, you probably don't go in. Prudence dictates you don't do it. Right? So it would have been absolutely right for us to send fighters up over the skies in Ukraine and knock Russian fighters out of the sky. It would have been morally appropriate to do that. We might have blown up the world. Okay? So prudence dictates, okay, we stand down from that ambition and we do other things. Okay? That should register as a tragedy, right? Because we can't do the things we ought to do because circumstances prevent it. So that's grim, and that should be a source of grief. It's not moral guilt. Not all grief is guilt. But we can't do the things that we know we ought to do. And life is sometimes like that, right? And a prudent government will stand down in those occasions. This goes back to this idea, though, about cultivating as much power as we can. And the caveat to that, when I say that, I think America should cultivate to itself as much military power as we can without violating our responsibilities in other areas, right? So there's a side constraint to that. But the more capacity we have, then the more opportunities we have to do the thing we know needs to be done, regardless of circumstances, because we've given ourselves a certain flexibility, right? That makes sense? Okay, so that's the jab. That's when is it right to fight, in a nutshell, all right? The jib, the jus in bello, how do you rightly fight the fight that's right to fight? Classically, there are two things that you need to be worried about. I'm going to introduce a third, and it's really the first, but we'll get into that in a moment. Classically understood, proportionality, and second, discrimination, all right? Proportionality in the jib, in the when is it right to fight, is also a question of balancing. Does more good than harm come from this thing? But here it becomes a question of whenever I do a particular tactic, whenever I enter a particular battle within this greater war, is this particular discrete action likely to do more good than harm as it leads toward the performance or toward the achieving of victory? Right? Because everything you do on the battlefield ought to build toward victory. If it doesn't build toward victory in some capacity, then you shouldn't do it. It's likely a waste of treasure or souls. Right? And so stewardship demands that you only do things that lead toward victory in whatever modest capacity or contributing role it has. All right? So it's a question, again, of balancing. Some people will say proportionality is you've killed 1,300 of mine. Any action I do in combat can't exceed you losing 1,300 people. All right? They think the balance is like numerical somehow. I can only harm you to the degree that you've harmed me. All right? And this isn't just people who don't know the just war tradition. This isn't just, lay people. This is like government officials think like this. I've had conversations at the Naval College, Naval War College, where people will discuss, for instance, they'll give scenarios. They'll say, okay, so like China can knock out our 911 system, our emergency system in, say, Los Angeles. They could do this. And by knocking out the automated portion of that system, they now require 911 operators to do what they used to do, which is to hear about an emergency and to manually dispatch, right, emergency services. This takes proportionately longer than an automated system, right? And maybe it takes another 8 minutes to get somebody on site. once the automated system is knocked down. And within that 8 minutes, over the course of 24 hours, it results in 3 additional deaths lives that would have probably been saved if the automated system hadn't been knocked out. So people will get themselves into a conniption, right? So if China does this, like how can we respond, right? Well, maybe we could knock out, the systems from which they launched the cyber attack that knocked out our system. But, but what if it results in more than 3 Chinese deaths? Oh, well, then we can't do it. And so they get into these proportionality calculi, I don't know what the word is, that twist them up and make them inactive, right? That's not proportionality. It's not quid pro quo, all right? So, for instance, deterrence theory. If you launch a missile at me, I don't launch a missile back at you, right? That's not going to deter you necessarily unless I hit something more valuable. But if you launch 1 missile at me and I'm going to launch 3 back at you, right? All of a sudden you might begin to be deterred, right? So it's the proportionality calculus is always aimed at the justified goal, right? Is this proportionate to the good of achieving my goal? All right, that's the first thing. And the second thing is it's not one discrete action. Like some people will say, well, okay, so there's a radio tower over there, and I want to knock out that radio tower because I destroy the ability of my enemies' command and control. And this will be important because tomorrow I want to invade them over here, and I don't want them to be able to communicate. But if I knock out that radio tower, I'm going to kill 30 people who have bivouacked around it because they've been run out of town and they need a place to sleep. So there's going to be 30 casualties, 1 radio antenna, 30 lives. It's probably not proportionate, right? Without paying attention to the idea that the reason I want to do this is over here. I want to fight this fight that I don't want the enemy to be able to communicate. And if I achieve this victory, then that's going to lead to this victory. And then that victory is going to lead to this victory. And then before you know it, the war is won, right? So the proportionality calculus builds on itself. Every discrete battlefield action can be proportionate in that it builds into other battlefield options, which lead ultimately to victory. Okay, so it's a complicated, non-simple calculation that you have to make that requires an immense amount of prudence and almost a level of omniscience that we don't always have. But it requires careful judgment. All right, so in a nutshell, that's proportionality. It's the second, I'm going to call it the third, and I'll explain why in a moment. The third thing you need in the jib, when is it right, or how do you rightly fight the fight that's right to fight, is discrimination. And discrimination is sometimes called distinction, but it's basically saying there are certain people that I have a right to harm, and there are certain people that I don't have a right to harm, and I need to qualify that. There are certain people that I have a right to directly and intentionally harm, and there are other people that I do not have a right to intentionally and directly harm. Okay? So throughout everything I say, intent is incredibly important. Intent is incredibly important in any kind of moral evaluation and moral act. All right. Basically, this is non-combatant immunity. All right, there are certain people who are immune from harm, non-combatants. All right, the only people on a battlefield that I have a right to directly and intentionally harm are combatants. Okay. Some people will call them the protection of the innocent in this sense. And innocent here doesn't mean non-guilty, because people might be guilty in all sorts of ways that don't leave them liable to be harmed. So innocent here doesn't mean non-guilty, it means non-threatening. Okay? So if there are people on the battlefield that are not threatening me, I can't directly and intentionally harm them. That's not as clear as it should be, right? Because what does it mean to not threaten me? This doesn't mean the sleeping soldier. This doesn't mean the soldier relieving himself against a tree, right? He's not an immediate threat, but he's a part of a system that is threatening me, right? So they're targetable, all right? Practical examples of this during when we had no-fly zones over Iraq, our airplanes would sometimes be targeted. They would just be like radar painted by Iraqi surface-to-air systems. And our rules of engagement at the time were, if this surface-to-air system engages an airplane, a US plane, by painting it, I can destroy that system. but I can't destroy this system because that system didn't do anything to harm me, right, or to threaten me. But these systems were mobile. And so the Iraqis learned we can paint US planes and harass them, but by the time they come back around, we can drive them under a tree or drive them into a barn or somehow or other move them, and they won't be able to be seen, and the US won't be able to do anything to deter us from behaving this way. So we changed the rules of engagement. We said, okay, if any one of them paints us, we can destroy any one of them, right? And so we shifted what discrimination in that sense meant, right? In Gaza, the question of what a Palestinian civilian is more complicated than it is in other fights, right? This is clear. The hostage rescue of 4 Israeli hostages that came at an enormous loss of life to Palestinians, and that on the surface seems very grim, and there may well have been things that were done that ought not to have been done by the IDF. But my understanding is that the people who were holding these hostages were civilians, right? Now, were they civilians who were impressed into holding these hostages? They were forced to? Possibly, maybe even likely, I don't know. But again, what are the responsibilities that those civilians have to not do certain things that leave them targetable, right? You don't have to be in a uniform to be targetable. 4,000, upwards of 4,000 people breached that wall on October 7th in more than 20 different breach locations. Not all of them were uniformed Hamas fighters. Not all of them were Hamas fighters. Some of them were simply civilians coming to loot, but that doesn't get them off the hook either, right? An awful lot of civilians went with an awful lot of Hamas fighters into Israel, right? That leaves them targetable. That's grim and all the rest. I also said that discrimination demands that there are only certain people that you can intentionally and directly target. So this leaves the grim subject of collateral damage or unintended civilian death, right? So you blow up that radio tower. I've said there were 30 people bivouacked around it. I know with a practical certainty by taking out that military target, I am going to kill civilians, right? But I do not directly attack them, and I do not intentionally attack them. I can prove this by saying if those 30 civilians left the radio tower, I would still take out the radio tower happily. I don't need the civilian deaths in order to achieve my mission, right? So this is collateral death. There's a doctrine called double effect that's very often pregnant, some of you know this, within discussions like this. Double effect basically says any action could have one or more consequences. Some of them are intended, some of them are unintended. All of them can be foreseen, right? I can know these things will happen and still not intend them to happen. I don't desire them to happen. And this gets complicated because what does it mean to desire that they happen? What does it mean to want things to happen? I've got a friend, Nigel Bigger, Oxford professor. He will say, retired Oxford professor, he will say that soldiers, in the West at least, do not shoot to kill. And if you say this in a room full of US Marines, it gets really loud, really quickly, right? And they go, "Arr!" And he says, no, just hold on. Let me prove my case. And what he'll say is, he'll refer to an Irish Marine, but let's say the same disposition. There's an Irish Marine named Patrick Bury who was in Afghanistan, and he and his men were walking down a narrow alley, and up ahead, all of a sudden they saw some displaced dirt, and they weren't sure, but that looks like it could be an IED. And they look over, and sure enough, there's this kid who keeps popping his head up above the wall, and then popping it back down, popping it up, popping it down. He's a spotter, in all likelihood, right? He's going to signal to somebody that the Marines are close, and they're going to detonate the IED and kill a bunch of Irish Marines. So Patrick Bury takes his sidearm, and when the kid pops his head back up, he shoots. But he intentionally shoots low, sprays brick and mortar in the kid's face. The kid drops down, and then he looks at his sergeant. He says, I'm going to call the EOD people to come and take care of the bomb. I'm going to call EOD. If he pops his head back up again, kill him. All right? So then Nigel asks, what did he mean when he said if he pops his head back up again, kill him? Right? Did he mean if he pops his head back up again, kill him? He says, well, if he meant that, then here's what the scenario would look like. He pops his head back again, The sergeant shoots him. The boy drops seemingly dead. They take care of the IED. They go around the wall to collect the body and discover the boy is still alive. All right? If he pops his head back up again, kill him, well, that's simple. You just walk up to him and give him another and kill him. Right? Is that likely what the Irish Marine would do? What would he do? What would he do?
Not shoot to kill.
And instead, he would do what? Right? He would call a medic. Right? That's what Americans do. That's what the IDF does. By and large, that's our characteristic. Right? So in this sense, Marines don't shoot to kill. Right? They shoot to end a certain sequence of events that might happen. They shoot to restrain. Right? Now, there are occasions. Somebody will say, oh, bin Laden. Right? Okay, there are certain occasions where we desire a corpse. But I would argue, and this is where, maybe philosophy becomes so abstract it's of no practical use, but even in things like capital punishment, where at the end of the day, I'm going to keep doing that switch or whatever it is you have to do until I have a corpse. But you can even ask yourself if, obviously I intend a death, but to desire that death in the sense of I have united my will to this thing, and this is a purpose for which I exult. That's one thing. Or you could say, with a manifest reluctance, I'm committed to the idea that justice requires that this person die. I wish it could be some other way. Circumstances that he has chosen have taken that desire and dashed it. He needs to die. That's grievous, that's grim, and oh, the evils in the world in which I participate. Right? I think we can do that, and those are two different types of intended action. Right? And the just warrior, ideally, it should be clear at this point that the just war tradition presupposes a certain kind of warrior. Right? One who cares about fighting discriminately and proportionately in the first place. And if one cares about fighting discriminately and proportionately, it must be, in part at least, because they sense that what they are doing when engaging in life and death is grim and difficult business. Right? And we're going to talk a little bit more in a moment about something called moral injury, which is going to make all of this desperately important. But the last thing I want to say, so proportionality, discrimination, those are classically the two bits you need in the jus in bello. How do you rightly fight the fight that's right to fight? Increasingly, some of us are adding a third thing, which is just articulating something that's always been there. And we put that as number one in the jus in bello. You need necessity. So this is obvious. You only do the kinds of battlefield actions that are necessary to build toward victory. So this becomes very clearly a matter of stewardship, right? You steward resources both in terms of lives and material, where you only do those things that are necessary. But this serves a second purpose. So I've already said in the jab, in the jus ad bellum, when is it right to fight, you have the duties, which tell you fight. And then you have the prudence, which might counsel maybe not so fast, right? So you have this side constraint on duty. Well, previously in the jib, in the how do you rightly fight the fight that's right to fight, all you had were the side constraints, proportionality and discrimination. Okay? You had no catalyst for action. Well, by articulating a doctrine of necessity, we are saying, well, look, there are certain things that are necessary to do if you're going to win this fight. And if those things are necessary to do in order to win this fight, do them. And be as proportionate and discriminate as you can. So that gives a little bit of a goad or a catalyst to action that was always obviously present, but that I think needs to be articulated increasingly in a society that is increasingly averse to the use of lethal force. And so that tells you to have it in that sequence of necessity, proportionality, and discrimination shifts the way that we do the calculus a little bit. So you see that an action is necessary. There's nothing else that in this moment will sufficiently help us work toward victory. It's necessary, so I have to do it. Now I have to be as proportionate as I can. But the good, remember, is victory. And so everything I do is going to be weighed against that good. And now I try to be discriminate as much as I can, right? So that's how that breaks down. I'm at an hour, so I want to stop. But the last thing I want to say is about this idea of moral injury, right? So I've already said that the just war tradition presupposes a certain kind of warrior, a just warrior, right? One who recognizes the gravity of their task. Everybody's probably heard of post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Sometimes rendered in this field post-combat stress disorder, right? And this is stuff that comes out of life-threat trauma, right? And it manifests in things like paranoia, hypervigilance, stuff like that. So back in the day, there was a VA, a Veterans Affairs clinician, who was working with combat veterans from the Vietnam War. And everybody had been diagnosed with PTSD. And Jonathan Shays, the psychiatrist, he said, and in fact, everybody manifests those things typical of having endured significant life-threat trauma. He said, but some clusters of those people had other characteristics that they were manifesting that weren't, didn't seem to have anything to do with life-threat trauma. And they were manifestations of debilitating levels of grief, of sorrow, of shame, of remorse, things like this. So he began to dig deep on that one cluster of people who were demonstrating those characteristics. And he realized that one commonality is all of them had a kill in their background. And it could have been having felled an enemy within the laws of war and under the auspices of the just war tradition. It could be a atrocity, right? They violated those rules. It could be an accidental killing. They didn't mean to kill this person, but they did. But they all had a kill. And so to cut a whole bunch very short, Jonathan Shay recognized that the number one predictor for what he was calling a moral injury, and there's two ways of defining this, the way I'm going to define it right now, is the doing or allowing to be done something that goes against a deeply held moral norm. Right? That leads to a certain kind of psychic trauma. And when you say it like that, it should. If you willingly violate something that goes against a deeply held moral norm, that should leave a certain kind of injury. The number one predictor for a moral injury is having killed in combat. Doesn't matter the kind of kill. All right. The problem with this is that the number one predictor for combat veteran suicide is a moral injury. So you can drop moral injury out of the equation. You can say the number one predictor for combat veteran suicide is having killed in combat. Right. So if that's true, then the very business of war becomes the number one predictor for combat veteran suicide. And the crisis behind this is that, as crazy as this is going to sound, American society, including an increasingly Christian society, believes that killing is wrong, period. And in war, it's sometimes necessary, right? So this is Reinhold Niebuhr, writ large, right? Killing is wrong, but in war it is necessary. And if you read combat veteran memoirs, you will see this all over the place. Maybe not exactly stated, but you will see the same idea. You will see it in American Westerns, right? The quintessential American film. You've got a milieu in which bad men are running roughshod over the innocent. The innocent can't do anything about it. Into this milieu comes the gunslinger, right? They clear away the bad guys, and then what does society do to the benevolent gunslinger who's just brought about the conditions necessary for order, justice, and peace? What happens to him? Thank you, go the hell away, right? They ride off into the sunset because there's no place for them in civilized society, no place for the man of violence. So Americans are very ambivalent about violence, no matter how good at it we are, right? We're very uncomfortable with it. We think it's some kind of a lesser evil, and we dirty our hands when we do the business of war fighting. That is not the Hebraic tradition, right? Killing comes in different kinds. Some of it is wrong, murder. Don't do it, period, full stop, right? If you do it, you should be morally injured. And the good news is we have remedies for that as well. Other kinds of killing are morally neutral, accidents. Maybe you should have been more careful, right? But by and large, it's morally neutral. And then there's another kind of killing that the just war tradition and the Hebraic tradition writ large says may be permitted and maybe even obligatory. And those kind of killings shouldn't issue in moral injury because you haven't violated a moral norm, right? But it should issue in grief because you have violated something that ought never to have been violated, but you had to do it. And this isn't the same thing quite as saying dirty hands, right? So you can imagine a surgeon or a dentist who's facing the same thing. So the last thing I'll say about just war is that it's not just about war. All right, it's a moral framework for thinking about conflict situations. So a surgeon, ought not to walk around wondering if he could lop the leg off a child, right? That's just not something a surgeon should spend their time thinking about. But if a surgeon who's a proper authority is presented with a certain case in which he sees a child has a gangrene leg that has to be removed or the child dies, the right authority identifies a justified cause. He has the right intent of restoring the child to health. He's going to evaluate whether or not this carving, this harm, and if you don't think cutting the leg off a child is a harm, you've got to rethink your definition of harm, which we could do. If that's not likely to lead to the child's health, if the child is so weakened it's going to kill the victim or the patient, maybe he doesn't do it. It's going to be proportionate, right? It's going to be discriminate. He's not going to cut off both legs. He's only going to cut off the one that needs to be removed. Right? So the same criteria that you see in the just war tradition is pregnant whenever we face a moral conflict. And that surgeon, because he leads to the salvation of the child's life, there's a certain joy that might be absent in the warfighter, but it's the same kind of calculus. The surgeon, if he really thinks about it, ought to feel a certain grief at having to cut the leg off a child because you've hobbled him, right? You've harmed him. You've violated bodily integrity, which you would never do if it was not morally necessary, right? So this is the same kind of thing going on in just war tradition. And I think it's only in a culture that remembers its classical and its Hebraic past that embraces something like the just war tradition. I think it's only that kind of culture that has the moral impetus to prevent a 14th day of names, right? Or to prevent Hamas from running roughshod over your people. So I think I did a bad job of arguing for the morality of the eradication of Hamas, but I'm happy to do that in the Q&A. Anyway, so that's it for now. Questions? All that?
All right, so we'll move into the Q&A section. This isn't projecting the room, this is for the recording, so I'm gonna hand this to you. If you guys could just hold it, that would be great. So that's all I hand back here.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. That was a really helpful overview of all these questions. I think my main question is something you touched on, but I'm wondering if all other options need to be exhausted to justify lethal force, and what that might look like. I think this is something that we generally assume is the case. Right. Right. That it's like you need to try everything else before you can, start, dropping bombs and shooting bullets and all of this. So that's part of the question. And then, in the context of Gaza, the IDF has received so much criticism for not running operations that are riskier to themselves in order to, potentially save more Palestinian lives, or to not have as many civilian casualties. Like, right. More like the argument is, well, if IDF soldiers, went door to door and were on ground and didn't use bombs, they would have much lower casualty numbers. So I guess that's the two-pronged question of do you need to exhaust all other options to get to lethal force, and what's the requirement of cost on your own side when it comes to these questions?
Excellent question. So the first one again is, I would say yes, you have to practically exhaust. But that doesn't mean you literally try everything, right? If you're beating in my face, I can yell for you to stop. And there's probably other things I can do, but if we're in the throes of it, there's only so much that, there are time constraints that limit my option of really trying other things. Some of it is just a mental calculus. Is anything likely to lead to overturning the cause for war? Than the actual application of lethal force. And if there still seems an opportunity for diplomacy or an opportunity to threaten and dictate terms, maybe you try these things. One of the requirements that some people will put in the use ad bellum in the prudential phase is declaration of war. You actually need to declare it. And this is a little bit of a lost art. We haven't done this in quite a long time. But a part of the value of that is to air, here's the grievance, like here's what's gone on, here's what we're about to do, and here's how you avoid that. And so that's an act of last resort, right? You've dictated terms. Every parent has done that with their children, right? You dictate terms. Here's the grievance. Here's what's about to happen. If you don't want it to happen, do this, right? So yeah, there's an obligation to do that. Time sometimes works against you, and like October 7th, I think there is nothing in that instance. I mean, you can tell Hamas, like if you all march out of the gates of Gaza and surrender, like maybe none of this has to happen, but you know with the practical certainty that that's not going to happen. But I think the IDF did in fact say, here's our war aim. It's the eradication militarily and politically of Hamas. And as soon as they surrender, this is over, right? The question of cost absorption, which is hugely important, and especially in light of what I've said about moral injury, is real. So you think, so there used to be a country called Yugoslavia. It broke up I think it was over Kosovo. There was a U.S. air campaign where we were bombing targets on the ground, Serbian targets on the ground. The rules of engagement dictated that American flyers fly at a certain height to avoid any risk of surface-to-air missiles, and the risk was very low. But we didn't want to absorb those risks because American political leadership is generally made up of moral cowards who won't absorb military deaths in order to prosecute a war more proportionally and discriminately. Again, some of which our special obligations dictates we do, and against which certain tenets of morality suggest we absorb certain risks. So the fighters that I knew said we're perfectly happy to fly lower because we're good at what we do. We can absorb those risks. And by absorbing those risks, those calculated risks, we will be able to hit with more discrimination and precision. And they wanted to do that. American leadership was unwilling to let them do that. American leadership should have let them do that, especially in light of the fact that when those bombs went astray, and you can guarantee that the news reporters on the ground would tell you when one of those bombs didn't hit the missile silo, but it hit, the school, the airman who dropped that ordnance knows what they've done. And if it's true that certain battlefield actions, including the unintended killing of innocent civilians, might lead to a moral injury, and a moral injury is the kind of moral trauma that might lead to debilitating degrees of grief and shame, then it becomes a force protection issue to make sure that we fight as morally as we can. So force protection, right? Anytime you do an action, a military commander is going to be concerned about three things. Mission effectiveness, right? Is this act going to be effective for winning the mission? Force protection, keeping my own people safe, and then civilian immunity, right? Keeping non-combatants safe. Those three things are always in tension. In light of moral injury, force protection is no longer just about physical protection, right? So this idea that I'm going to kick in a door in order to be more discriminate is incredibly dangerous physically. But we've learned that some of that physical danger we should be willing to absorb because we prevent, to a greater degree, moral harms from happening to our troops. And if it's true that moral harms lead to suicide, then it's all physical in the end of the day, right? So the IDF should absorb a certain degree of physical harm or threat in order to fight more discriminately. But this idea that they haven't done much to increase their own risk and preserve Palestinian lives is bollocks. It's insane, right? The amount of warnings that the IDF regularly employs, from leaflets to they're fighting an urban warfare with like space age ideas. They drop sometimes speakers by parachute, and when they hit the ground, the speakers tell everybody around to clear the area. They'll sometimes do this hours, days, even weeks in advance. I mean, when they moved everybody from the north down past the river, what's that called, the Ghazi Wadi or Wadi Ghazi or whatever it's called, that took weeks, right? They signaled to the enemy, and they tell people, if you want to be safe, go down this road to that place, right? They give so many warnings in advance. Maneuver warfare, which is the way we all fight our wars, is predicated on speed and surprise. And the IDF will constantly eliminate speed and surprise in order to keep people safe. So they've absorbed an enormous amount of risk already. Could they do more, go house to house? They could, but in all likelihood, the real risks of that would be so disproportionate to themselves that it would just be practically impossible. I mean, Hamas has had 15 years to turn Gaza into a fortress. And into that, you don't want to send anybody, right? But those are the kinds of questions you have to ask.
All right, we have a question over here.
Thank you, Dr. LiVecche. My name is Dimas. My question is talking about the relationship between the sovereign and its people. When it comes to just war, you talked about how the sovereign has a moral obligation and duty to wage justified war, and obviously a model for political stewardship. You mentioned about specifically Hamas, about it being elected. A little thing about it. Even though it was legislative elected in 2006, they staged a coup and killed Fatah and members and everything in 2007. What's the relationship between a sovereign that is in that capacity to its constituents and obviously a sovereign who doesn't care but is only focused on one specific item? What's the relationship there when it comes to just war?
Yeah, it's a good question. If I give the same talk tomorrow, I will probably talk about Hamas as a terrorist organization and not a political body. It's going to depend on how I wake up, because look, the international community has treated Hamas like a legitimate political authority, and you can say legitimate advisedly or whatever, but we've given them tens of billions of dollars in aid with the expectation that they build a state, or at least begin to build a state. So we treat them as the de facto, let's call it that, that's a safe word. They are the de facto political authority in Gaza, right? And because they are the de facto political authority, whether they want to embrace it or not, they have a set of political responsibilities that they have obviously abdicated. Like most enemies that we fight, even when they use human shields, they use human shields in part because they know by using the human shield, they're not likely to be targeted. Hamas employs human shields in an incredibly clever way, in that they are hell-bent, and I say that probably literally, on a policy of human sacrifice. Like, that's their war aim. Their war aim is not directly to defeat the IDF. They know they can't do that. Their war aim is to have the IDF kill as many Palestinian civilians as possible so that the world tells the IDF to stand down, and Israel no longer has any other option. That's grotesque in every conceivable way. So, they're the de facto political authority. They've abdicated any political responsibility whatsoever. And therefore, I think under the auspices of just war morality, it's the burden of the international world to go in and to end that. Okay, I just said something that I probably shouldn't have said. It's the duty of the international world to support the IDF to go in there and to end that. But in one sense, it's no different than when Assad is barrel bombing his own people, right? This is why we had to come up with this R2P, this responsibility to protect, because when international law says, well, the only reason we go in to fight is self-defense, but then we look over there and we see what Assad's doing to his people, and we think, well, God, it seems like we should stop that. We don't have any grounds to stop that if self-defense is the only reason we do things. So there's this idea that a king can unking themselves, and they fail to meet the responsibilities of being a king. And so it might be the responsibilities of that king's neighbors to do something, to cross a border and to stop it. Is that helpful? Okay.
You alluded to just war theory having its roots in the Hebraic tradition.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you could describe some of the distinctions between a Jewish approach to just war and a Christian approach to just war. Are there any distinct ways that a Christian, as opposed to like a Jewish person, would approach, let's say, the justice of a war in
Right.
in
I'm
Gaza?
going to punt, and I'm hoping that you can do more of that later. And I feel really guilty about this because I have a book sitting on my table at home that I'm supposed to review by Shlomo Brody.
The
I don't know if you guys.
Fighter. Yeah, I just read
Okay.
it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I haven't read it yet.
good.
I can't say a whole lot about the Jewish way of fighting.
Sure.
in order to answer that question well. So
Well, then I have another question if I could ask.
Yeah, please.
To be greedy.
And if you can answer it, feel free.
We could talk about it later.
All right.
I'm just really curious. Well, in that case, then, how would your approach to just war theory inform actually like a preemptive strike on, let's say, Iran, which is obviously in many ways using Hamas and Hezbollah as proxies? So what would be the ethics around that, and how would just war inform that?
So he used the word preemptive, which is a good word. There's also another word, preventative, right, which he didn't use, which he shouldn't have used. But these are two ways of, and this is literally wrong. These are two different ways of starting a fight. Why is this literally wrong? We're not starting a fight if it's preemptive, okay? Paint the scenario. I do something that makes you really mad at me. Or I don't even do something. Let's not cloud it. I know you're really mad at me for whatever unjustifiable reason. And my understanding is that you might hurt me. And so I find you, and I find you sleeping, and right? I take care of this problem, right? That would be preventative. That is, in most cases, wrong, right? I can't do that, all right? But if I know all this, and I'm walking down the street, and I look over, and I see you walking at me with a baseball bat, you do this, and before you hit me, I go, ah, and I take you out, right? That's preemptive. You haven't hit me, but you've given me every reason to believe that you're about to. And now I can preemptively strike you, and it's all under the auspices of just war morality. That's fine. So that's an important distinction. The 6-Day War, when Egypt had massed their war-fighting apparatus on the border. They had already done an act of war by closing off a port, so that makes this even easier. But if you forget about that for a moment, just by the massing of troops all around, Israel doesn't have the luxury of letting the enemy hit first, because if you've been there, if you know anything about the country, if Israel takes a step back, they're in the water, right? So they can't absorb a first strike. So they preemptively struck Egypt, and that was fine, right? So now, Iran. Morally, I think the West, I think Israel has every right to strike Iran. Now we come to that question of prudence again, right, and whether or not that's the prudent thing. I think some of the little strikes that are done, the cyber stuff that's done, the isolated hits that are done, taking out a guy like Soleimani, when things like that are done, I think all that's morally appropriate and probably very helpful. I'm shocked that we haven't hurt Iran in any, at least publicly recognized way, since they started outfitting the Houthis to disrupt, global shipping. That's insane. Right? They need to be deterred from doing that. And Iran seems to respond very well to strength. And so I think we should do enough to deter them, and not enough to, send the region in flames. At least not right now. That'd be kind of the answer to that.
Another question over here.
And then we got one down here too.
Hello everyone. My name is Eliza. Thank you so much. So the Old Testament is riddled with wars, and the entire eradication of some populations, really simply because God said so. And I'm sure there's a question about just war in that. But when talking about today's war, is it fair for us to make a parallel between today's war of an eradication of an enemy of God and God's people and Old Testament wars?
Right. This aside, I think, so I say this under, the ability to be corrected. I think in all of those cases it was pretty clear that, God gave a kind of verbal imprimatur to some of these fights, right? I haven't heard it in contemporary fights. That's not to say that God doesn't speak through circumstance, right? So if you've got a moral framework like the just war tradition, which seems like a biblically faithful, theologically faithful, rationally faithful way of addressing moral conflicts, then God is going to speak through those things. Like in one sense, I'm a really poor sola scriptura kind of guy, because I don't know what that means, sola scriptura, right? We have reason, we have context, we have all sorts of ways of understanding Scripture. Scripture interpreting Scripture, like, so which sola scriptura, right? The question becomes complicated. I think there are all kinds of means of assessing God's desires. And so we can say that we believe it is morally appropriate for a Christian or a Jewish army to do such and such, which must mean something like we think God sanctions this, which comes perilously close to saying we're on God's side, or God's on our side. All of which you have to be really careful about. But I mean, I think if we're honest and we think we've launched a just war, and if we think we're fighting the just war justly, that's kind of what we're saying, right? Yeah. I'll leave that there. There's different ways of thinking about just war tradition, and there's one whole school called the revisionists, which they take this idea in interesting ways by saying, I also think it's true that at most only one side, at most, could be fighting a just war. Maybe neither side is. But by definition, two sides can't be fighting a just war. But because I don't have omniscience, I can't be 100% certain that I'm the guy fighting the just war, right? And so that creates certain obligations within that fight that I have to adhere to because I might be wrong. There's a school of thought that says not only is it true that only one side can be fighting a just war, but by definition, the other side can't do anything that is just within that war. So the Russians cannot kill Ukrainians proportionately, because if it's any war aim that the Russians have is an illegitimate aim, it's an evil aim, and therefore there is no amount of good that can be achieved from pursuing that evil aim that outweighs the evils, right? So the revisionist school takes this idea of morality in some ways more strenuously than even the classical sort of Christian tradition, which accepts a degree of ignorance.
Who else has questions? Because I know we don't have. Oh, there's a lot of questions. Okay, so I promised the mic over here, and then if we could try and do as quickly as possible.
Yep.
And then if
I'll be
there's
succinct.
not enough time, we can collect questions and then find a way to get Mark to answer them. So I want everyone to have their questions answered.
Well, thank you. I'm Amanda, and I'm a Tommy, if you're an Ole, so there's that too. But
Tommy, like St. Thomas?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
All right. I like St. Thomas better than I like St. Olaf, so.
My question, I've noticed this a lot with talking about this war being just or not. People relate bombing as if it's somehow worse to Hamas raped and tortured people before killing them. Mm-hmm. When you talk about moral injury having an effect on soldiers and stuff, does that come into play at all? I would think if you bomb a place that you've warned them to leave, right, there wouldn't be such an injury. So do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, it's a good thought. I think the degree to which you can do the right thing is every step you can take to increase the ability of you to do the right thing probably increases your ability to morally absorb whatever unintended harms come from the act. But I think they're always still going to be there. So, I think if I just bomb you and I inadvertently kill the innocent, that's one thing. If I've warned you to get out, and then after the deadline I bomb and I inadvertently kill the innocent, there is further room, it seems, for me to be able to say, I warned them. But I think we're still human beings. We're still good Jewish boys and girls, men and women, whatever. And I think it's still going to leave its mark. I make a distinction in my book between a moral injury, which is a full-blown moral trauma, and something I call a moral bruise, which is still an impact trauma, right? You've been hurt, but it's a bruise. It's temporary, it's more surface, but there's still a recognition that, I've been hurt, I've been harmed, but it shouldn't be debilitating. So I hope that whenever the innocent are killed, whoever's responsible for those deaths, which ultimately is Hamas, but still, you can be causally, but not morally responsible for something. And so the people that are causally responsible for those harms, the IDF, they should feel the grief of that. They should be sorry, right? Golda Meir famously told the Arab nations, we'll forgive you for killing our kids, but we will never forgive you for making us kill yours. And that seems to me the right sort of attitude for a just warrior. Right?
We have a question over here.
I think you're going to get missed.
Thank you, Dr. Marc LiVecche, for speaking.
Sure.
I know you mentioned that you thought you didn't do a good job of explaining the eradication of Hamas, but I think you did. It's
awesome.
Just dependent on Hamas
right.
to stop, and that's where I don't have a lot of hope for. I don't think anyone else does.
None.
But
Zero.
Another thing I think we're also suffering is a war of misinformation, especially online. Mm-hmm. So my question was kind of relating to your brief studies of Nazism and the Holocaust, how about how Nazism was like mutually agreed upon by a lot of people that it was bad, it was a genocide of people. But then this war that's happening right now is being painted as a genocide of innocent
Right.
Gazan civilians, and that the actions of Hamas is resistance. So how do you respond to that? Because I struggle, especially online, like talking to people about it, how I'm painting it as this, but they're like, oh no, but they're killing innocent people, you don't understand that. So I wanted to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah. So my first response to like the challenge or the charge of genocide is to puke in my mouth. I'll say more. And we talked about this on a podcast, that if it's true that Israel is like hell-bent on a plan of genocide, like they are really bad at it. Like they are incredibly incompetent, because there is no demonstration that is the way they're fighting whatsoever. So like intent, I said, is important, and intent is notoriously difficult to know with any certainty, but there are clues. Right, and one of the clues, when you're constantly warning people, when you're standing down, when you're pausing the fighting, and you're doing all these things, these do not add up to a strategy of genocide. They just don't. When you look at Hamas and you see the way that they're fighting, that amounts to a strategy of human sacrifice. And you can say, okay, I see your intent by the way you're behaving. Right, so the genocide claim is ridiculous. What were some of the other?
It's kind of related to like how Nazism was mutually agreed upon as a bad ideology
Yeah.
by a small percentage of people.
Right.
But now I feel like with this war, misinformation online, everyone's like, oh no.
Yeah.
Hamas,
So
what Gaza is doing is right.
I think the modern West and the modern Christian West, maybe especially, is incredibly uncomfortable with power, right? And so we run most of our moral analysis through calculations of power. If you're weak and I'm strong, I must be wrong, right? The IDF in one sense is significantly stronger than Hamas. Israel in one sense is very much stronger than Hamas. But Hamas is exercising an enormous degree of power because they've maneuvered this entire thing into being, right, by their actions. Actions have consequences. Israel's simply responded to actions, which demonstrate the enormous power that Hamas has to provoke Israel into necessarily responding. So I think we're uncomfortable with power. We see the IDF as the victimizers, structural systems that are in place to oppress the Gazans. Why that same zeal isn't applied to Hamas, who had 15 years to build a state? They built, an arsenal instead. The idea that when they broke or breached the barrier fence, some people tweeted that Gaza's broken out from their open air prison or whatever it was, the prisoners are free, is crazy. I mean, they haven't been occupied since 2005. They've been given every opportunity through international aid to begin building a viable community, which probably would have set into motion other good things on Israel's side that would have began to build one on top of the other until Gaza was something much more viable as a state than it is now. So I just think it's the way the modern world looks at issues. But when you talk about misinformation, it's clearly true. I think we were talking about it last night. The man on the street interviews with some of the campus protesters. They don't know anything very often about what's happening. They have partial information. They make judgments. And they just don't have, you can't do ethics if your facts on the ground are wrong. And their facts on the ground are wrong, willfully or not, I don't know.
Thank you.
Two more questions, I'll finish. I'm sure it's going to be so good.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Mark. My name is Will Duggan. Thank you so much for everything you shared. My question is fairly broad, and Eliza actually kind of touched on this point. But in a lot of conversations I've had with Christian leaders, one of the things that I've found is when talking about just war theory and then the Ezekiel 38 war, right? We know the prophecy of that all nations eventually will abandon Israel. I've heard a lot of Christians take the position of, I would say, Christian pacifism when it comes to Israel. Not necessarily that they don't care about the humanitarian aspect of it, but that Israel will be protected by God in the end. Therefore, we should limit our military intervention. I don't personally hold that belief, but my question would be, in having a dialogue with Christian leaders that do, how would you maybe justify the current actions taking place in Israel from the American point of view, the West, and Israel itself?
Yeah, I mean, I in some ways this takes us back to the question over here about, what is God saying? So it seems to me one really good way to figure out what God is up to is for me to simply do the next right thing, and then after that to do the next right thing, and then the next right thing, and keep doing that until circumstances clarify. So I see 4,000 people breach a barrier fence and rape and pillage and murder and burn and loot and do all those things with every intention of going, we forget that they were stopped, right? And so the intelligence and the material that we took from some of the dead Hamas fighters suggests that they were planning on going far deeper into Israel than they managed to. It was only because ordinary Israelis stood between them and slowed them enough that they didn't get as far as they did, as they wanted to. When you see an action like that, you respond appropriately to it. And if God is up to something, God will be up to something, and he can figure it out. But I think, very often God's will is for me to do the right thing. I think it's as simple as that. And so these questions about, apocalyptic scenarios well beyond me. All I know is I do the next right thing. I know that, my grandfather's physical pain is an evil, and I long for the day when he no longer suffers and he's with Christ. I'm not going to, hurry that day. I'm going to resist it. So you just do the right thing. Jean Elstein would hear that question. She would say, well, I'd respond to those Christians by just going, oh. Right? So sometimes that's all I got.
Take it away.
Right.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Of course.
I appreciate it. So I wanted to go back to the idea of, you were talking about how the U.S. military doesn't shoot to kill. And, okay. Oh, but it's not on.
No.
It's recording. Okay.
It makes you feel like you're asking a question.
Yes. All right.
Look at him. He's starting to sway.
Okay. So going back to the idea of the U.S. military doesn't shoot to kill, right? And then you brought up the example of the Irish Marine and that whole moral situation with the child, right? And then you started talking about the idea of like desiring a corpse, right, with Osama bin Laden. So it's kind of like, and I'm trying to get at a philosophical principle here.
Nice.
Because every single force of power or regime is going to focus on an ethical standard, right, by which they operate. And so, I also think a lot about how when there's a war going on, they're operating on these ethics and these principles, but at the same time, they're opposing another ulterior ethic, right? And so that's kind of even at the beginning of the discussion with the idea of we have to hate something in order to love something. So, but ethics are embodied through people, right?
Right.
Ethics can't just be these abstract principles. And I also think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer because he was strictly a pacifist, in World War II until Hitler, came about, and then he saw evil embodied. So I guess my question, and I wanted to give context to it, is how would you see the idea of ethical principles, right, being established in wartime, and then to what degree are we allowed to decide who embodies that ethical principle more than the other? Obviously, Osama bin Laden or Hitler, they are the embodiment of the ideals of those ethics of whatever force of power the regime is trying to fight against, as opposed to the child. In the other example, he's probably just being forced to do it, or especially with Hamas and the children that have no clue what they're doing, holding these weapons. So I guess to what degree do you believe that forces have the right to determine this person is embodying the ethics that we're against, and which person is not embodying the ethics that we're against?
So great question. In one sense, a reasonably simple answer. And the simple answer, again, is innocence isn't indicative of not being guilty of anything. It's whether or not you're intending or causing harm or threat. So the Irish Marine, in evaluating whether or not to kill a child spotter, doesn't have to ask the question regarding the degree to which that child is bought into any sort of ideology. Does the child pose a threat? That's it, right? That's the standard. And the rest of it, I can be concerned about, and it will, when I go back inside the wire and I'm safe and I'm reflecting back on what I've done, it'll certainly come to the fore. But do they pose a threat? So, like there's a scenario that some philosophers will paint of you get into a car, and the car, as far as you're aware, is well running, it's well maintained, you've done everything right, you've decided to climb in it and go for a drive. And whatever the scenario is, you're at the top of a hill and you hit some black ice that you had no reason to believe was there, and now your car is careening toward me. And I happen to have a bazooka. And the only way for me to save myself is to blow up your car, right? Do I have a right to blow up your car? You do not mean me. You do not desire in any way to harm me. But you pose a threat, or at least the vehicle you're in poses a threat, right? So do I have a right to harm you? And in this situation, it's those little distinctions that begin to matter, right? I'm not the one who chose to drive. I'm not in the car. I don't pose a threat to you. You pose a threat to me. And some people will say, based on that, I have a right to, shoulder my bazooka and blow up the car and save myself, ascribing no guilt or blame to you as an agent, just to the circumstances. And then you take that and you extrapolate from there. And if you're a child spotter, you've been forced to, you've been forced to plant an IED, or you've been forced by circumstance. I want to put milk on my table, and the only way that I can in this war zone is to plant this IED, be given some money, and feed my family. You're still targetable, right? Because you're posing a threat. And that's part of the grief of war, right? It's part of why last resort is so important. Like, let's do all the right things that we can to try to prevent these kinds of hellish scenarios from ever happening, which we know will happen if we launch into a fight, right? But sometimes you can't help that. So, sure.